Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, we're here with Keldon from the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Project. A few weeks ago, they put out a report on the different ways in which the food sector in Canada is monopolized and oligopolized, and I'm going to link that in the notes below. But I thought this would be something we should have a conversation about, particularly because the government put out their big food strategy a couple weeks after this report came out. And so I just want to, have a quick chat about what you found and whether the government's plans are addressing this.
Yeah, thanks for having me. No, it's been a big week for food policy in particular. We had Empire, owner of Sobeys, announce that they were walking back some of their property controls that they've used to, or that have had the effect of killing grocery competition in Canada. We can talk more about that. But it
Hmm.
has been an exciting couple of weeks in food policy in Canada. And a big thing that we're glad to see is that we've had a very long running conversation about competition at the grocery store, the sort of retail level, and that's important. But
Yeah.
something we were glad to see, specifically in the federal government's food security strategy, was taking that focus and looking at the other layers of the supply chain, distribution, processing, because all of that goes into what Canadians pay at checkout.
Yeah. And it's the ways in which a lot of the processing is what I thought was interesting in your report was how much of that is really concentrated among very few players.
Yeah, Canadians are pretty familiar with the lack of options at the retail level. But the bad news is that the further you go up the chain, the level of concentration and consolidation that's happened is much more intense. And that's an issue not just for consumers in terms of the variety and the choice that they have, but also for the producers, whether you're a farmer, a grower, or a rancher. The question of how do you process your raw materials, your commodity products into usable goods, or get them to market, you have fewer and fewer options than you did before. So again, the average Canadian really shouldn't have to think about this, even in sort of a farm to table kind of way of thinking about things. The average person doesn't really have time to wonder whether there are enough beef processors in Canada, and they shouldn't have to. But unfortunately, what's happened is that those markets that are unseen have really concentrated in an extreme way.
Yeah, it seems to me that beef processors was one of those bottlenecks, particularly a few years ago that came up, where it was like, the fact that I think it was pandemic where there was just not enough processors in the country and they couldn't actually get product through the chain because it turned out that there was only a handful of them across the entire country.
Yeah, I mean, well, we're seeing that again in the States with this horrible lettuce-based parasite outbreak, let's
Yeah.
call it. But it's an example of how when markets consolidate, you don't just lose competition, you also create much more brittle supply chains, much less resilient. If a facility goes offline, in Canada, there are really three facilities that process the vast majority of the beef, produced and consumed in this country. One of those goes offline for whatever reason. The stakes are much higher than if we had a much more diversified supply chain. And
Yeah.
COVID, you're right, was a great example of this, but it continues to live on as we can have quote unquote efficient supply chains, but it leaves very little room for error when something inevitably does happen.
Yeah, it seems to me that was one of the lessons out of the pandemic that not enough people seem to really internalize was that by making everything so efficient and just in time, that we had absolutely no resilience when one link in any of those chains went down.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a funny couple of weeks for the lessons of competition. There was a good article yesterday talking about, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Grocery Code of Conduct.
Yeah.
This is an industry led effort to rebalance the relationship between suppliers and retailers,
Right.
large suppliers.
I believe it was voluntary that the government essentially said you need to sign on to this or else.
Exactly. And, the reporting yesterday said something that isn't super surprising, but is very valuable to understand is, participants in this code fear actually bringing forward complaints because they know that they could be retaliated on either by one of their biggest suppliers or one of their biggest buyers. And this is just, again, a reminder when you have this kind of consolidation, supply chains become more brittle, you open yourself up to retaliation, and you see higher prices for consumers. So, I mean, I hate to say it, but we are getting a bit of a crash course in the past couple of weeks over all the dangers of this consolidation.
Yeah, and with that code of conduct, it seems to me one of the impetuses for creating that a few years ago was something around it was retailers forcing suppliers to pay for upgrades in stores or something to that effect, which just kind of blew everyone's mind that they had that kind of a power to do that.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the great things about being a monopoly is you can take the riskier parts of your business and shift that risk to different parts of the supply chain, whether it's your buyers or your suppliers. And, I think a lot of the things in the code of conduct are fairly standard that you could imagine. You can't change the terms of a contract retroactively. You can't, delay payment for goods or change the terms after goods have been delivered. But again, when you're one of the biggest people on the block, you don't really have to abide by those rules. And I do feel for the people who feel like they can't actually make use of this code because they could be retaliated by the same company that they're under the thumb of.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I guess one of those object lessons that people don't think about at the time. But then it comes to bite you in the end.
Well, the UK went through a similar experience. They had a related issue between the relationship between major retailers and smaller suppliers. They started with a voluntary code. That didn't work. They brought that into law, but didn't give it teeth. That also didn't work. And today they have, just as Canada has the Competition Bureau, they have, I think it's got a sufficiently bureaucratic name like the Grocery Supply Code of Practice Adjudicator, really rolls off the tongue, something like that.
Yeah.
But this is a
Sounds
body, yeah, I mean, this is a
yeah.
body that has the ability to investigate and to, levy fines for violations of a code. And that at least gives people participating a little bit more hope that someone actually has their back should they encounter some of these practices.
Now, is that a role that the Competition Bureau fills in this country at all, or is that somewhat separate?
I mean, they do, but at the level of the entire economy, and there's only so many things that they can have their eye on. The Competition Act is basically a set of, thou shalt and thou shalt not. What makes up fair competition in Canada? So, in some ways, I would say yes, but in another way, the Competition Bureau is not responsible for a specific sector or the regulation of
Mhm.
certain very specific practices. That's something that's probably best left to the provinces who have domain over contract law, property law, and could
And
actually have
consumer
a much
protection as well.
exactly
Yeah.
that they could play a much more direct role in the food system.
Do they play enough role in this system? That's one of my other particular pet peeves with the federal system in Canada is you have a lot of provinces who just simply don't.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we'd like to see a much more active role. One province that is leading the way right now is Manitoba, looking at their grocery sector and saying, why are incumbents allowed to pick where competitors can and can't set up shop? I think that's a really important move, and we'd love to see other provinces come along. But between their unfair business practices, whatever they call it, different names in
Mhm.
different provinces, and their consumer protection authority, there's a lot more that the provinces could be doing, especially if they're moving as a pack with some level of coordination.
One of the questions I wind up having when we're having this conversation about competition and opening it up and removing the property controls and the various things that the federal government is proposing in their national food strategy is how long that's actually going to filter, how long it's going to take to filter down before we actually see a measurable effect on prices. And that's always kind of the thing that I worry about because we have the government saying we brought in all these measures to lower prices, but I wonder, like, that's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah, I mean, I wish we could cut more ribbons in the competition space, but it doesn't always work like that. I think the food security strategy in particular is the positive side is it's a set of investments that create the conditions over a medium and long term to
Mhm.
have a more balanced food system. I think there's a desire for a bit of a big bang action. If we, in theory, break a company up, open up a supply chain, something like that. But the reality is, this is something that's happened over at a minimum 40 years, and in the process has been running a lot longer than that. To
Yeah.
walk back this sort of consolidation, it does take time. And so, we're always pushing on the structural systemic side of things. But in the meantime, it does make sense to have some sort of relief, especially for low and middle income Canadians, because the reality is we just don't get to cut the ribbon. These things take
Yeah.
time to evolve. But I guess to talk out of both sides of my mouth briefly, you think about something like property controls, there are existing competitors who want to compete in more markets. I mean,
Yeah.
the I believe Suzanne Rent, who, if I'm getting the name wrong, I apologize, but reporting for the Halifax Examiner years ago, found why do only some Dollaramas sell bread as opposed to
Right.
others, and this really kicks off the property controls discussion in Canada, and so we owe her a big debt for that reporting. But that shows that actually relatively quickly, if you look at existing retailers and say, you don't have any of those restrictions anymore, we could actually have more competition relatively quickly while we're still making these investments over the medium and long term.
Okay. All right. That's good to know. Um, I guess my last question would be, was there, if there's anything in the food strategy that you think is still missing or that the government kind of dropped the ball on?
It's always, we always want more. There's always more to do,
Yeah.
but we want to understand and appreciate the value of these incremental steps and things that I think are going to pay off. One thing that I would have liked to see, and this would be, jointly between the government, I think, and the Competition Bureau, is a really strong signal that any sort of further consolidation, particularly in grocery retail, but further up the chain, is going to get really strict scrutiny from the Competition Bureau. The Bureau can't say ahead of time, this merger is good, this merger is bad. But what it can be clear about is to say any merger in this space is going to get a fine tooth comb. And so if you're proposing something like this, you better be in it for the long haul.
Mhm.
That would change the math in the boardroom of the decision whether or not to buy up a competitor or invest in an alternative or expansion. I would have liked to see that, even if it's just expressive, because Canadians need a clear signal that this kind of consolidation is over and that we're headed in a new direction.
Yeah, I guess I would just wonder there as well, though, because it's not always up to the bureau, and it can wind up at the tribunal, who will let it go ahead. Thinking particularly about the Rogers Shaw merger.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think
zooming
that everything,
out,
yeah, the Competition Bureau tried to push back against it, and the Competition Tribunal in the end just said, no, that's fine.
but two things that are positive, sort of one that's happened and one I think for the future. Since Roger Shaw, we have had a real strengthening of our merger law, and
Okay.
we're getting the tests now, but it is a fundamentally different game than it was before then. But to your point about the Competition Bureau versus the Competition Tribunal, something we should be thinking about in the longer term is, should the Bureau have to be the litigator or can they be the decider?
Hmm.
Other countries, the UK, Australia, they have a model where their competition authority has much more decision making power, and those decisions are reviewable by a court, as opposed to in Canada, where the competition enforcer is a litigator and the specialized court is ultimately the decider.
Right.
That I think is where we probably need to be going over the longer term to avoid the sort of barnacles that have grown up around the law, around these decisions that have allowed these major mergers.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to do this. And once again, I'm going to encourage everyone to read the report that's linked below. And we'll talk again.
Thanks so much for
Thanks.
having me.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at journo_Dale on Twitter and journodale no_ on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.